Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Jay Weaver and Nicholas Nehamas to discuss Dirty Gold, the rise and fall of an international smuggling ring, published by Public Affairs. Jay Weaver is an award-winning reporter at the Miami Herald who has covered the courts, government, and politics in South Florida for 25 years. He was a member of the Miami Herald team that won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news in 2001 for its coverage of the federal seizure of Elian Gonzalez. Nicholas Nehamas is an investigative reporter at the Miami Herald. He was part of the global team of journalists that broke the Panama Papers and won the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Dirty Gold from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome. Hello.
Hello, thanks everyone for having us. I'm Nick, and this is Jay Weaver, my colleague and co-author.
How are you?
This is actually our second book talk at Books and Books. Our first book, The Grifters Club, about the President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago Club. Books and Books was kind enough to host us in August. At that time, we kind of jokingly said that we expected our next book, Dirty Gold, we'd be able to host a live event at Books and Books. Unfortunately, we're still in the midst of the pandemic, but it feels like normal life is getting close to returning. So thank you so much again for being here. So we're here to talk tonight about our new book, Dirty Gold, co-authored with our former Herald colleagues, Jim Wiss and Kara Gurney. And we like to start these kinds of talks by asking our audience to look at your rings, your earrings, your cell phone, your watch, the very laptop on which you're watching this panel. There's probably gold in all of them. And the question we learned after reporting this book out and the Miami Herald series on which it's based for the past 3 or 4 years, the question you should be asking yourself is, do you know where your gold comes from? There's a good chance that, in fact, it was mined at illegal sites in the Amazon rainforest where desperate miners tear up riverbanks, bulldoze trees, and spread toxic mercury throughout an ecosystem that indigenous people depend on for food. So in the prologue to Dirty Gold, we quote Pope Francis, who visited Peru's illegal mining capital, a 42 square mile gash in the heart of its most ecologically diverse province. And Pope Francis said, "Gold is a false god that demands human sacrifice." And that is really a theme that runs throughout our book. And it gets worse than that. The pipeline that brings this gold from Peru, Colombia, and other Latin American nations to the United States has been infiltrated by narco-traffickers, armed criminal groups like the FARC, and the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Today, illegal gold is actually a bigger business for criminals than cocaine, and it's a lot safer for them too. If you're stopped carrying gold into the US, you can produce forged paperwork that says the metal was mined legally. If you're stopped carrying cocaine, there's no paper in the world that will get you out of jail. So our book, Dirty Gold, stretches from the jungles of South America to gold pawn shops in Lima, Peru, and Santiago, Chile, to Miami International Airport and a Doral-based company called NTR Metals, and then into your pockets and your jewelry. The book is filled with characters that you could only meet in a Florida tale, like the Florida State University MBA grad who conquered the illegal gold market, the Peruvian wheeler dealer dubbed Peter Ferrari for his love of European sports cars, tight shirts, and beautiful women, and a former Air Force pararescue trooper and one-time rodeo cowboy who joined the DEA and ended up fighting to stop Dirty Gold from the American Embassy in Lima. So I want to rewind a little bit to 2017 and ask Jay how this tremendous story of Dirty Gold first came onto your radar.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Nick. This story was kind of a hard story to fully grasp at first. I have covered so much financial fraud and so many other major issues in South Florida, but I'd never seen anything quite like this one. And this was involving a case where it was a simple money laundering conspiracy, but it was wrapped around the idea of smuggling illegal gold into Miami. And so I had to understand, why is that illegal? Why is the gold coming into Miami? Why is Miami this big hub for gold? And so I began to realize that there was a whole backdrop to this story. And it dealt with drug traffickers, criminal gangs, the rainforest, poor miners just subsisting on the gold trade. And it dealt with South America, Miami, the United States, and the entire global community of gold and international trade. So what happened is I humbly felt a little in over my head. So I ended up, after writing a few big stories about the case, and bringing in Nick and bringing in Jim Wiss and bringing in Kira Gurney, because I realized that this story needed a lot more than just coverage of a criminal case. This involves so many personalities, so much terrain, so many different types of laws that were being broken, and so much of this big gold industry in the United States and globally. So we put together a team, and we started developing this project for a big series that ultimately won a Pulitzer Prize finalist award in 2019. And we lost to a story that was published by the New York Times. There's something about Trump's taxes, something about that. You might know it, something about it. But anyway, that's how this all came together. And we used each of our different skills. Nick brought in a lot of money laundering and business expertise. Jim brought in a lot of the Colombian and South American expertise, and Kira Gurney brought in a similar expertise. And so we divided up the work, and we pulled it all together. But writing the series, as difficult as that was a fairly familiar experience, because we know how to write big stories. What we didn't know how to write was the book. And Nick can tell you how we turned the newspaper series into a book.
Yeah, so forgive the echo there. So a few weeks after the series published, and it made a big splash, it was picked up by the Drudge Report, of all things, which got it a lot of web traffic. And then, Senator Marco Rubio responded, and a bunch of other lawmakers. And we got an email out of the blue from a publisher in New York called Public Affairs. Jay and I, and Jim and Kira, had never thought about turning it into a book. That had not crossed our minds, but Public Affairs specializes in turning newspaper investigations into books. And they reached out to us and said, would we be interested? We jumped at it. And I think what we found is, as Jay said, we are very used to writing in newspaper style. Every clause has to be properly cited, according to blank, 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 12,000 pages of documents reviewed by the Miami Herald show, 12 people with knowledge of the situation told reporters. You have to be very careful and clearly show your work. In a book, you have to be just as careful, but you have so much more freedom to write. You can put yourself like a fly on the wall in some of the scenes we created, like Juan Pablo Granda, the FSU grad I mentioned earlier, who is one of the main characters in the book, and went from being a subprime mortgage broker to a gold smuggler, essentially. It was liberating to kind of put ourselves in the minds of the people we talk to and write from their perspective. And so instead of having to say, according to 3 people interviewed by the Miami Herald, if 3 people tell you the same story, you just write it like you were there. And that freedom allowed us to create a narrative that really drove the book forward. I mean, we talk about all the problems I mentioned when I was introducing the book, the environmental devastation, the human rights abuses, the promotion of drug trafficking and the cocaine trade. But what drives this book forward are characters. And, for instance, if you've taken a look at the book, the first scene where Juan Granda walks into a dark room to meet one of Peru's biggest drug dealers, just to get the detail that there was a shotgun leaning on the wall took 3 interviews. And what kind of shotgun was it? Single barrel, double barrel? So, those are the kind of details that being able to spend a year on this project allowed us to incorporate in the book. And of course, since this is a book about characters, you need to get those characters to talk to you, the real human beings. And we were writing about a very sensitive subject. People had gone to prison. There were, federal agents and prosecutors who couldn't talk about the case. There were, for many people, this was the worst experience of their lives. Jay has a long history as a reporter in South Florida who is as well sourced as anyone I've met. I've never really had an experience where I said to Jay, "Oh, do you know that lawyer? Do you know that defense attorney? Do you know that prosecutor?" And he says, "No, never heard of them. Never talked to her on the phone." So Jay really took the lead, and I've learned a lot from him in just how to make people feel comfortable and open up. So Jay, can you talk about how we got the characters in this book to speak with us?
Well, it was a challenge. I mean, there were 2 parts to this book. There was reporting it, and then there was writing it. And reporting it, we had an outline, we had an objective, we knew the information we needed to get, but it's easier said than done. I had to, for example, talk with a lot of federal sources to get them to feel comfortable with our doing a book while there was an ongoing criminal investigation, because this case wasn't just about, going after the 3 original named defendants in the indictment. There was a whole cast of characters. And so we had to get the federal prosecutors to agree to talk a bit. We had to get the agencies to agree to talk a bit. And there was one agency in particular, Homeland Security Investigations, that took the lead in the Gold investigation. They had been at the head of it for about 5 years or so. And this case was unfolding over a long period of time. And then we had to deal with...
I apologize, but I'm not sure why we're having this sound issue. I'm not sure if I should maybe... Jay, can you try speaking again? It seems to be on
I'd
your...
be happy to. Can you hear me all right?
Do you have any tabs, any additional tabs that are open on your computer?
No, just the one for the Books and Books presentation.
Okay, I'm not sure why it's carrying over that way. Do you want to try again?
Yeah, so where I was picking up, I mean, it was the challenge of getting different sources to feel comfortable to talk. And we're talking about federal sources. And as people know, law enforcement, federal sources, they don't just open up. And I had a long-term relationship with many of them. Some were willing to talk, others were not. But it wasn't just them. We had to get the defendants to talk with us as well. And Juan Granda was one of the 3 amigos, as we came to call them, who really did open up and was really helpful in meeting with us when he was in prison. And we met with him a half a dozen times and spoke with him, for a couple hours each time. And it was not easy. We couldn't record him. We had to write everything down on, pen and paper, no recording devices, nothing. And that was him. And then we had to deal very discreetly with different sources who were around the story. And that was not easy. And I can't really go into who they were because I want to respect their privacy, but they were extremely helpful. And then Jim Wiss pulled off a miracle by getting several interviews with Peter Ferrari, the the money launderer who was supplying a lot of this gold that was coming from Peru into Miami. And then lastly, another key component was Kira Gurney, who interviewed Harold Vilches, another big gold supplier in Chile. And he was extremely helpful because his life rights belonged to a Miami film company. And that film company bought our book rights and agreed to let Kira and our team talk with Harold Vilches. And he filled a whole nother character in this book that really made it complete. So maybe you can talk about a little bit, Nick, the division of how this work was done.
Yeah, so, when we wrote our first treatment of this book, we were really thinking about, creating this kind of sprawling book that looked at, mines in Peru and dealers in Colombia, people in Miami. And as we wrote it, we realized, that might work for a newspaper series, but we needed a really tight narrative. And so we focused on, as Jay said, these three Miami gold traders that we called the Three Amigos from NTR Metals, who conquered the illegal gold market. They came in, and Jim got a great quote from one of their competitors in Peru. They would travel back and forth from Miami to Peru, Colombia, Ecuador. This rival said that Granda and his people were like lions that just came in and ate up all the gold. And they were able to do that because they didn't care where the gold came from. There are plenty of legal licensed mines in Latin America, whether they're small or big multinationals. But NTR Metals was buying gold they had no idea where it was coming from. And a lot of it was coming from this illegal mines. So we split up this narrative very clearly. Jay and I took NTR Metals and their parent company in Elemental in Dallas, which was one of the biggest gold traders in the U.S. at the time. And we also looked at the federal law enforcement agents who became aware of this case gradually over time and worked to bring down the Three Amigos and NTR Metals. So the narrative is set up very much as I don't want to say good guys, bad guys, because it's much, much more complex than that. But, kind of an outlaw and a sheriff kind of narrative. And so Jim traveled extensively in Peru. As Jay said, he interviewed this Peruvian gold magnate, Peter Ferrari, who was once accused of dealing in stronger stuff than gold, I should say, repeatedly accused. At one point, Peruvian authorities alleged that he painted lead bricks in gold so they would look like gold and stuff them full of cocaine and was shipping them to the United States, which our co-author Jim called a veritable turducken of criminality. So Jim handled, the Peru side of the story is beyond fantastical. I worked with Jay, as I said, on the federal agents and the NTR and the prosecutors and, trying to piece together what happened on the law enforcement side, which was very difficult because, they're not able to talk about that. I also went to Jackson, Ohio, which is where all the gold from Peru that traveled to Miami was melted down. It's in a rural part of Ohio. This refinery was like a miracle. The Wall Street Journal wrote a story about how this refinery was changing life for people in rural Ohio, and all that eventually would come tumbling down. And then Kira, as Jay said, went to Chile to interview, and she really focused on a young college student named Harold Vilches, who became Chile's top gold dealer, a huge supplier for NTR of what turned out to be Peruvian gold that was being smuggled across to Chile and passed off as Chilean gold. So it was much easier to get into the US because Peruvian gold became metal non grata after a certain point when people realized where this Peruvian gold was really coming from. And Kira was able to get, incredible details, including the whole story of Harold Vilches traveling outside of Latin America to Tanzania, which he thought would become a new center of gold for his company, where he was almost kidnapped and detained by armed men. There's a car chase. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book. And as Jay said, we've signed a film and TV deal with local producers, J.D. Frasius and Tony Gonzalez. They recently completed a project about Miami's Cuban mafia starring Benicio del Toro. And they're developing a scripted series of this book, Dirty Gold, making great progress. And they're working with very well-known Hollywood actor and environmentalist. But I'll let JD and Tony say more about that another time. So I want to talk a little bit about the logistics here, Jay. Can you explain, how does this gold get from alluvial, river mines in the Amazon rainforest to the United States? And why is Miami such a central character in our book, in addition to the smugglers and the agents and the prosecutors and the dealers that we've kind of been talking about so far?
Well, it's a good question because, frankly, I was clueless about Miami as the gold capital of the United States when I first learned about this case back in 2017. But I also learned that I wasn't the only clueless one. A lot of people in Miami had no idea that all the tons and tons of gold was coming in on airplanes into MIA on a regular basis. And this was in a period when it was the post-recession. The economy was not doing very well. The real estate market was slowly starting to come back in Miami, which drives the local economy along with tourism. And this gold prices started going up dramatically. And so NTR Metals and their parent company, Elemental, had a voracious appetite for finding new areas to harvest gold and bring it to the United States. And so they opened this business in Miami, NTR, because it's so close to South America, and it is, the gateway for, to the Americas here in the United States. So Peru was the place to be, and the NTR Metals brokers set up their beachhead there, and Juan Granda was their main guy, and the main supplier was.
Sounds like you're on a UFO, Jay.
I know. I'm not sure why that echo starts out, but anyway, there was this guy Peter Ferrari with this rather checkered history. There was suspicions about him being a drug dealer and about the fact that he had been collaborating with them. So he got from the Peruvian mines in southern Peru, which is where this area called Madre de Dios is. And it's an area where you have a lot of subsistence miners working illegally in an area called La Pampa. And it's about a 45 square mile area, and it has been devastated. It's been deforested. There's all kinds of, not only just devastation of the rainforest, but there are hoses that are used to try to extract the gold from, the alluvial valleys there. They use mercury to separate the gold from the ore. And all this gold comes out of there and is eventually melted and remelted, and it comes through the middlemen in Puerto Maldonado and Lima. And eventually it is flown out of there by NTR to Miami. And by the time it gets to Miami, nobody has any idea where this gold comes from. And so the feds in Miami built a whole case, this idea that gold was illegally mined, papers were falsified, customs officials were bribed, and all of that. And they also alleged that drug traffickers were behind it. And that's where the dirty gold metaphor really comes from. And so they made their biggest deal with this guy, Peter Ferrari. And he had a whole bunch of shell companies and straw men who were basically fronting for him, but he's the guy that organized everything. He was, the puppet master. And so he and a lot of other aggregators were selling their gold through Peru. And everything in Peru was going fine until the end of 2013. And that's when things went bad, because there was a huge crackdown on Ferrari. And so it opened up a whole nother sort of journey for this gold from Peru, and it started being smuggling into these neighboring South American countries. So I think I don't want to give away too much, but I'm going to switch it over to Nick and ask him a little bit about, once this gold gets to the United States, how does it get to the rest of us? What happens to it?
Right. So, as Jay said, it's brought to the U.S. by guys like Juan Granda. And I want to talk a little bit about Juan Granda, Samer Barrage, and Renato Rodriguez. So, they ended up being charged in this $3.6 billion money laundering conspiracy, but they were really far from hardened criminals. They were salesmen, they were bankers, and
Yeah, I don't know what's going on, but there seems to be a reverberation from both of you. So I'm wondering if I could take turns, like close out one of your videos and try bringing you back in. Can we try that just to see if
try
it
it.
resolves the sound issue?
Let's try it.
Okay, so let's try you first, Nick, okay? Okay, there you are. Now I'm going to try you, Jay. And basically, I'm going to close out your video and I'm going to re-prompt you in, okay? So just
Okay.
accept and join. Nope, it's still happening.
Hey, maybe turn your speakers down. Turn your volume down, maybe. Okay, let's forge ahead and see what happens. So the point I was really trying to make is that these are family guys. Juan Granda takes care of his mom. Renato has a tattoo of the postmark from the letter that his dad wrote to his mother, asking her to marry him. He bakes cookies for his daughters on the weekend, and yet it's really a story of greed and turning a blind eye. None of these three amigos really thought they were doing anything wrong, because there is a interesting policy issue down in South America where, these people are called artisanal miners. Many of them they're subsistence miners. They're desperate. They have no education, no technology, no other way to make a living. And the only way they can make a living is by destroying the rainforest. There are other communities of miners who have been practicing more sustainable forms of mining for generations, really. And then you have these multinational mines that come in, and they're the ones that get the titles. They're the ones that get legalized and formalized and are able to sell their gold to international markets. And so the little guys feel like the big foreign companies are coming in and screwing them, really, and taking away their livelihood. And so Granda and Barrage and Rodriguez, in part, kind of thought to themselves, well, we're helping out the little guys. We're helping them get access to international markets. Of course, in reality, they were also contributing, as we said, to the cocaine traffickers who secretly own these mines, laundering money to, an area in Peru alone, an area 3 times the size of New York City, has been stripped to bare modeled earth. One person we talked to, said that it looked like Verdun, World War I, one of the worst battles of the war to end all wars. It's orange and green, pits full of chemicals. The jungle is gone. It's really horrifying. I mean, if you look at it, it looks like a moonscape. And just a few weeks ago, NASA published some satellite photographs from the International Space Station, where you could see just these gaping gashes in the jungle, kind of glowing gold from all the chemicals and things running through the water down there. And I say all that just to remind us that this is a good chunk of the gold that comes into the U.S. in rough bars called doré, and combined with silver. And then it has to be refined and purified into metal that can be used for jewelry, electronics, and bullion. And there are not that many places that can do that. It's a very complicated chemical process. There are 4 big refineries in the U.S. that process imported gold. And one of them is right here in Opelika, Florida. would guess that many of the native Floridians on this call had no idea that one of the world's biggest gold refineries is really right around the corner in one of South Florida's poorest communities. Another of these refineries is in Massachusetts, a third is in Utah, and the plant we wrote about, the one owned by NTR Metals' parent company, was, as I said, up in Jackson, Ohio. And once the gold is refined, it enters the U.S. consumer market. It's sold. NTR Metals, the company we focused on with the three amigos, had more than 70 Fortune 500 companies among its clients, everyone from Apple to Tiffany's to Starbucks, yeah, we never really figured out why they use gold, but General Motors and many, many others. So, there's a really good chance that all of us have used products with this illegal gold from NTR. And we should say NTR was not the only company buying illicit gold out of Latin America. They were simply the best at it. And they were the biggest, and they were the ones who ended up drawing the attention of federal law enforcement. Now, law enforcement had been aware that gold was a problematic industry, gold being imported into the U.S. since the 1980s. That was when the first agents started raising concerns about the nexus between drug traffickers and the gold industry. But no really major cases were built until 2017. Jay, can you explain why it took so long for this case to happen and why this one was so significant?
Well, for starters, the biggest problem in South America, of course, has been for more than a generation the exports of cocaine from Colombia, from Peru, from Bolivia, and also through some other countries, more lately Venezuela, even though they don't produce the cocaine. So the focus has always been on the drugs. And there's been a mindset change at DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the FBI to a lesser extent, because they don't do drug trafficking investigations as much. Homeland Security does some of them. But in general, they weren't paying as much attention to the precious metals business and the connection between that and drug trafficking. And it really wasn't until a Homeland Security agent, saw this spike in 2013, 14, 15, and saw these numbers come up dramatically with all this tons and tons of gold coming into Miami, that he was able to team up with a prosecutor and the U.S. Attorney's Office and really focus some attention on it. I mean, the regulatory authorities like FinCEN, which is part of the Treasury, which works on the civil side enforcing the Bank Secrecy Act, and the Treasury Department and the IRS, and again the FBI and Homeland Security. Until this case, nobody really was focusing on really seeing that connection, the illegal connection between gold and drug trafficking, and so it was an innovative case. It was a case that really was a first impression, and so it took this prosecutor working with what he ultimately put together as a Fellowship of the Ring, this group of DEA, Homeland Security, FBI agents, along with a lot of other people behind the scenes, to build a case to finally do something about it. And he came up with this novel money laundering law that was a part of a treaty between the United States and Peru. And he was able to show that there was all this underlying illegal activity going on behind the illegal mining and behind the importation of all this gold. And in doing so, he was able to make a case stick. And it was really not just hiding the proceeds of drug trafficking, but it was using all these proceeds to literally promote an illegal gold smuggling activity. So this was all wrapped up in a big money laundering conspiracy. And so finally, he made the biggest case there'd ever been in the history of the United States regarding precious metals. I mean, until now, there'd really been just more violations of having what they call money laundering compliance at corporations, at banks, elsewhere. But that really deals more with regulators. Nobody had ever seen anything on this scale before. And it everybody away, including everybody in the industry. And I'm talking not just about gold importers and refineries, but the bankers who finance the industry, because it's built a lot on financing of overnight deals, and money is fronted and paid back immediately. And so it really spooked that industry, the banking industry. And it also, created a lot of problems in Miami and other parts of the country, like Boston, like Salt Lake City, where there are major refiners, but also in Switzerland. It had reverberations in the Emirates, in the Middle East, and also in China, in India, where there are tremendous buyers of gold. So it had worldwide repercussions. So there'd been nothing like this before. And so this case set a precedent. It caused a crackdown, but it didn't end dirty gold. And in fact, with the pandemic hitting a year ago, it had a kind of unique effect on this industry. And Nick can tell you more about that and wrapping up with this.
Yeah, so as Jay said, there was this huge crackdown, a big case. People got spooked. Things quieted down after our series came out and after this case. You could see gold imports kind of slowing down to Miami. They were going to Switzerland and China, India, Dubai, these other, huge gold-consuming nations. That has started to change now, and it's because of something that's all too familiar to us, unfortunately, the coronavirus pandemic. Big mines in Latin America were either shut down or severely limited in, how many employees they could have at one time, and gold production fell off. At the same time, because of the economic crisis from the pandemic, prices soared. Gold is a very stable, or considered a very stable, safe investment. When times are bad, you go to gold. And in fact, that's kind of what led to the first boom, the boom that we write about in our book. The reason Granda and NTR and all their competitors wanted so much gold was because of the recession. Gold was extremely valuable. Well, now, because of the pandemic, gold prices are at one point recently even higher than they were back in the period we were writing about. And so illegal miners are flooding into new parts of the jungle that were untouched because, again, there is so much demand for gold. And, you have leaders like President Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil who have basically opened up the country, the rainforest, to logging and cattle ranching and gold mining. So, this is not a problem that ended with one federal court case. It's still a huge problem. And the experts we talked to for this book suggested that the best analogy to dirty gold is blood diamonds. And the way that the blood diamond crisis, Central Africa, Civil War, child soldiers, similar things to what you see with blood gold or dirty gold, the way that crisis was lessened, at least, was consumers kind of demanding to know where their diamonds came from, that they were conflict-free. It's not a perfect system by any means, but it put a lot of transparency into the supply chain. That can be more difficult with gold. Gold can be melted and remelted and forged into new forms. And, there's no chemical test you can do to say, oh, this gold came from, this part of Peru, that's an illegal mine, or that's a legal mine. Once it enters a supply chain, its origin is lost and the paperwork can be forged very easily. So there are a lot of efforts by nonprofits and public companies to make sure that the gold goes directly from the mine to the refinery, so that there are none of these middlemen, these Peter Ferrari characters, although he's much bigger than a middleman, he's a multimillionaire, who can kind of hide the origin of the gold. The more hands the gold passes through, the worse it is. So if you are, buying gold, there are certifications like Fair Mind out there now, that can ensure your gold is clean or relatively clean. And these groups work with miners in the jungle not in the jungle, I should say. Jungle mining is really problematic. There's not much of a way to do it sustainably, but there are communities, away from the rainforest where mining it can be practiced sustainably. And what these groups teach miners to do is to use more advanced techniques, because the mercury, which we've been talking about, is used to separate the rock from the gold, but it actually destroys a huge amount of the gold yield. It's not an efficient way to mine gold at all. The miners just use it because it's easy and it's cheap. And then, of course, the mercury washes into the rivers, it gets into the fish and the food chain. So the miners aren't the ones with mercury poisoning in the end. It's the indigenous people who live miles away down the river who eat the Peruvian catfish, which was actually banned by the government at one point because it was so toxic. And even a state of emergency was declared in a Peruvian province over mercury poisoning that the people who lived hundreds of miles away from these mines were experiencing. And so, as I said, these groups are trying to develop more sustainable mining practices, but it's an uphill fight. And, the U.S., for its part, has not brought another gold case. This was its big effort. They're still looking at the problem, but, attention has kind of shifted elsewhere. So I do think it's up to everyone who's listening to this and who reads the book to start thinking about gold as a conflict commodity, like we do with others. So I think we'd love to take some questions now. Let me pull up the bar. Jay, let's see. Okay, this one I think applies more to Kira and Jim. I wish they could join us tonight, but Jay, maybe you can talk for their experience. At any point, did either of you or the other authors fear for your safety because of the reporting you were doing?
Well, I can speak for them only because they probably, especially Jim, probably had more potential exposure to criminal activity or criminal gangs than Nick or I. mean, Nick and I were in the United States, so we were pretty protected. Nobody was going to come after us. We were talking with sources that, some were reluctant, some were willing. But in Jim's case, he went to a pretty rough area of La Pampa. He went to these campsites. He went to these mining sites. He went to this town, Puerto Maldonado. He was interacting with people all over the place, but he's a pretty savvy guy because he's been a correspondent in Colombia, Venezuela, and been to other countries in South America, and he knows how to get around.
And imprisoned in Venezuela, we should add, by the Chavez regime, I think it was at the time.
Yeah, that's right. Jim was actually imprisoned by Maduro, the president of Venezuela. So for a period of time, and then he was let out. But the reality is, he knows his way around. He knows how to deal with people, and he never said he was threatened. Things went fairly smoothly for him, and he's been covering, the drug trafficking world for a couple of decades too, and so that's sort of a bookend to this illicit industry, and so he was able to handle it pretty well. He never talked about any issues, but yes, there were potential threats, more to him, not to us.
Yeah, and at the same time, Jay, so Jim did go to the big boom town, this Wild West town in the middle of the Peruvian Amazon, Puerto Maldonado, but there was no way he could actually go to the mines. It is a no-go zone, even for Peruvian police and government agents, nonprofits, journalists, absolutely not welcome out there, at least past the outskirts. And there are all these, rumors that have never been confirmed of former gold sites that have been filled in with the bodies of lawbreakers, because the people out there police their own, and not always with any kind of due process. Even the U.S. government, when they went to visit these mines, they would go in armored SUVs, and they would be in and out. They'd drive in the morning and they'd be out by the time night fell. I mean, these are really incredibly dangerous places. And La Pampa, which is, this big mine we've been talking about a lot, this huge gash in the jungle, it was actually shut down by the Peruvian military. They came in, they cleared the camp, the tents, the shanty towns, they got everyone out of there. And then the military picked up and left. And, I'm sure you can guess that a few miles down the highway, these same miners are now at it again, despoiling a new patch of rainforest, and the military is nowhere to be found. I mean, in this province in Peru, it's 40% of the economy is related to gold mining. And, the governor of the province is a gold miner, the former governor. I think when Jim was down there reporting for the series, he interviewed the mayor of a town who was a gold miner. This was during the Pope's visit. And a couple of weeks later, the guy was arrested for corruption. So, it's not a safe part of the world by any means. And it's because these criminals who run the mines have really taken over the infrastructure of government in some serious ways as well. Let's see. More questions. Was it difficult to break through the news dominating for the past year, COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, the presidential election, to get attention for these stories and this topic? So we were kind of fortunate. I mean, the original series came out in the very beginning of 2018. It was supposed to come out in 2017, but which hurricane was it, Jay? Matthew?
I forget, but we were delayed, and it was a good thing.
I remember this was my first real hurricane in Florida, and we all lived in the newsroom for, a week. We were on duty because the newsroom is hurricane proof, backup generators. And I was there, hunched over my computer, eating packs of tuna that I'd brought. And Jay, who's been in Florida for 30 years, and his teenage son, I saw them go into the office kitchen with these beautiful frozen pasta meals that I think Marta, Jay's wife, had made, defrosting them. I was very jealous of you that night, Jay, but that delayed the story by, a couple months because we were covering the fallout of the hurricane and everything. And it ended up being published in January 2018, just really a couple weeks before the Parkland shooting. And a couple months before the FIU bridge collapse, which killed 6 people. And so, we didn't have time to do any follow-ups about gold at that point. We were just in full breaking news mode. And then this book was originally supposed to be published in January, much closer to the presidential election. But the same publishers reached out to us and asked us and 2 other colleagues, Sarah Blasky and Caitlin Ostroff, to write a book about Mar-a-Lago. And so Dirty Gold was pushed back to come out in March, which, Jay, maybe we can talk about why that was probably a good thing in terms of,
Right. So we had competing books here. And so we were competing with ourselves. And, the reality is that the Mar-a-Lago book, The Grifters Club, and I worked on it with Nick, and it was led by Sarah Blasky. She was the main writer, and she took more time off to work on it. But the point is, they wanted that done immediately. And it was a different kind of book, but it had to come out during the presidential election season. And so Dirty Gold was kind of put on hold. We'd written it, rewritten it, it'd gone through editing, but it was literally put on hold. And our editor said, look, guys, this book is not going to come out until 2021. And we thought, we were so disappointed. But the reality is, we were kind of glad because the Grifters Club came out in August along with a dozen other Trump books. And then once Trump lost the election and, that faded and Biden took office, COVID was always dominating the news, but there was an opening. And this book has come out during a period when all that other news, especially Trump, has sort of stopped dominating the daily news cycle. And there's finally, there's room for something else. And so our editor who made this recommendation could not have been more on the money. He was spot on.
Yeah, so I wanna switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the Miami Herald and why it's so special as a local newspaper, and the way that it allowed us to do this book because most local newspapers, in fact, none that I know of except maybe the Dallas Morning News, have a foreign correspondent. But Miami, has so many connections abroad. I mean, as we know 1 in 2 people who live in Miami-Dade County are born abroad. That we actually had a foreign correspondent, Jim Wiss, based in Bogota, traveling the continent doing stories, because for the Herald, stories in South America are stories in our backyard. They're local stories, and we're very upset that we lost him to Bloomberg, although we're happy for him too. We miss him a lot. But the point I want to make here is that, the Herald is not a normal mid-sized daily regional newspaper. We take international affairs really seriously. And so, we pitched our editors on having Jim travel South America with a photographer and a videographer. I was able to travel up to Jackson, Ohio, and do this story. The Herald is, committed to these kind of local, national, and international stories. And there are not many places in America where you can write a story like Dirty Gold as a local reporter and turn it into a book. And so I hope everyone here on this call, if you're not a subscriber and you live in the area, you will sign up and support the Miami Herald, because we absolutely depend on subscriptions from readers. We all know the journalism industry is in trouble. Programmatic ads don't make quite as much money as the industry executives had hoped. So we need people to support our work with digital subscriptions, because, it would be easy for Jay and I to sit at our desks and write, whatever crime briefs police send us, or, the FBI, but that's not the kind of work we do. We're not mouthpieces for the government or for corporations. We go out and we find real important stories like this one, and we tell them, and we're lucky enough to have editors who support that. So, the Herald is a lot smaller than it was, Jay, when you started, I'm sure, but we're still hitting way, way, way above our weight. And I know we're supposed to be talking about the book, and I hope everyone, please do order your copy, and Jay and I will be happy to sign it after the pandemic is over. But Jay, maybe you can talk about how the Herald has just maintained its strength despite the shrinking that this entire industry has gone through.
Right. I mean, what I think is impressive about this line that we punch above our weight class, it's true, because we used to have 50, 100 more editorial staffers, reporters, editors, copy editors, even more foreign correspondents, more coverage in our capital, more coverage in Tallahassee. We are diminished in size, but what has happened is we have a very strong beat structure, and we have editors who have been at the paper a long time, who understand how to cover not only just the local story, the watchdog story, the government story, and politics, but they still do the investigative story, and they still do the big breaking story. And this is something that we know how to do with a smaller staff. And this is something that a lot of newspapers don't have the skill set for. There's very few papers in America, like the Miami Herald, that have won as many Pulitzers, has won as many major awards, because they've always had this long-standing tradition of being able to cover news. And it's not just, it's not just the reporters they hire or the editors that they have. It's this tradition, and it's stayed with the paper even after it's been diminished in size. And so that's why we were able to do this. I mean, I remember on Dirty Gold, for example, when I learned that we were finalists for a Pulitzer, I learned that, from a few sources, that the Pulitzer Committee wanted to know whether we had somebody who actually, traveled to Peru and was on the ground, and, was also, in Colombia and was on the ground, to provide that complementary reporting that we were doing here. And that's what made the whole thing complete. If it had just been a story about Jay Weaver and Nick Nehamas covering a criminal case in Miami, it wouldn't have won, or wouldn't have been a finalist. But what made it so complete, what it was bringing it home and talking about what was going on the ground and how it was devastating the rainforest, how it was polluting the environment, how it was causing all these health problems to all these workers that work in the mines, who subsist on these mines. And of course, it talked about the drug traffickers and their extortion rackets and how they control these mines. And so we combined that with what we did here, and it gave it this sweep and scope to make it a much more engrossing tale. And I think that's what caught the attention of the judges. And that kind of work is really hard to pull off unless you have editors and reporters who know really how to just connect the dots. But it's more than just that. It's a whole presentation. It's in the newspaper, it's online, it's graphics, it's interactive maps. It's a whole panoply of ways to present a story today.
Yeah, so it looks like we're out of questions unless anyone has a last thing to say, and almost out of time, but we've really, really enjoyed being with you here tonight.
I cannot wait for us to be in person back at the bookstore. And I am so sorry about this echo. It seems maybe, Jay, you have 2 microphones on somehow, but we obviously did not have a chance to test that out. So I admire your perseverance in talking through the reverberations. See, I can barely talk because I've been so nervous, like watching this whole thing. It's still been a fascinating conversation. And I can tell you that everyone stuck around. Nobody left. So that's wonderful. And I thank you both so much, always, for being with Books and Books, virtual, in person. I remind everyone that's watching from everywhere that you can order the book by just pressing the green button. We'll ship it right out to you. You can also pass by any one of our stores if you're in Miami, and curbside pickup or pick it up there. And I want to thank you again for being with us tonight. Thank everyone who's been watching. Apologies for the echo, but you still came across.
That's great to hear. And I promise for our 3rd book, we will do it in person.
Please. When is that? When is that happening?
I'm kidding. We need a vacation. If there is a 3rd one, it'll be in person.
We have something in mind.
Yeah.
Or we just do this again in person.
Exactly.
Maybe in the summer, hopefully.
Yeah. Sorry about all that. I hope it wasn't my microphone.
Thank you for spending your Thursday evening with us. I hope you enjoyed it. We had a great time. Thanks so much.
Thank you
very much.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Be well.